Thanks for joining us. I'm Susan Page of USA Today, sitting in for Diane Rehm. She's recovering from a voice treatment. The Supreme Court announces it will review President Obama's executive actions on immigration. The Senate blocks a bill on tougher refugee screening. And in the Republican presidential race, Sarah Palin endorses Donald Trump as the battle for conservative voters heats up. Joining me for the domestic hour of the Friday News Roundup, Ron Elving of NPR, Karen Tumulty of The Washington Post, and David Rennie of The Economist. Welcome to the Diane Rehm Show.
Great to be here.
We're going to invite our listeners to join our conversation a bit later in this hour. Our toll-free number is 1-800-433-8850. You can send us an email at drshow@wamu.org. Find us on Facebook, on Twitter, and if you want to see what we look like, video of this hour of the Friday News Roundup is streaming live on the web at drshow.org. Well, you know, we have been talking about the 2016 presidential race pretty much since the 2012 presidential race was decided. Finally, 1 week from Monday, voters finally get to weigh in with the Iowa caucuses. And Ron, this is the week we saw the return of Sarah Palin endorsing Donald Trump. How important?
Probably not that important, except that it does extend the longest winning streak in winning the day, the week, the month in the media that we have ever seen in presidential politics. This man, Donald J. Trump, and now we've all started calling him Donald J. Trump, partly because Sarah Palin did, and he has dominated again this week because of Sarah Palin, and she will probably also have some substantive help for him in Iowa because she speaks to a lot of the people that he's contesting there with Ted Cruz.
So some good news for Donald Trump, Karen, maybe more bad news for Ted Cruz.
Yeah, not only was anything he said this week pretty much obliterated by the media saturation coverage of the Sarah Palin endorsement of Donald Trump. And I'm ready for all the callers who want to explain to us how unhappy they are at how much time the media does spend covering people like Sarah Palin and Donald Trump's endorsement. But, you know, he also had a number of, you know, Donald Trump turned his full force and fury on Ted Cruz. He not only was questioning whether he's a natural born citizen under the constitutional requirement, but he was talking about Ted Cruz's temperament and how nobody likes him and said he couldn't get anything done. And you had some GOP establishment figures like Bob Dole weighing in and saying, you know, Donald Trump would do better in a general election than Ted Cruz.
You know, David, there are a couple of surprises here. One is that the leading candidates as we head into the voting turn out to be Donald Trump and Ted Cruz. I don't think we saw that 6 months ago or maybe, you know, a week ago, but that seems to be the case. And the other is the division in the Washington establishment, the Republican establishment, about which of those two they would prefer. What are you seeing?
Well, I think what you're seeing is the extraordinary cynicism of quite a part of the Washington establishment. And I mean that part which is embracing Donald Trump. Now, my own magazine, The Economist, we're not big fans of Donald Trump or Ted Cruz, to put that on the table. We don't think either of them would be the right pick for the Republican Party as far as we can tell at the moment. But I think that if you're going to be harsh, what the establishment is saying is that they know, because they're smart people, that both Donald Trump and Ted Cruz are lying through their teeth to the voters about what is possible. They're promising things that cannot possibly be delivered, whether it's a wall on the border paid for by Mexico on Donald Trump's side, or whether it's, you know, these impossible things that Ted Cruz keeps promising he can do in Washington, and then it doesn't happen because the Republican traitors are, you know, betraying the cause. So they think both of them are liars. I think their excitement about Donald Trump right now is that they think he is probably a more pragmatic and flexible liar who will switch in the general to slightly more kind of subtle and cunning lies, whereas they worry that Ted Cruz will keep going with these rather narrowly ideological lies that don't have broader appeal. I don't think, you know, they don't believe either man is telling the truth about the program they're offering.
What do you see, Ron? Because there is a division. You have Bob Dole saying he prefers Trump over Cruz, but you have National Review, which has a long history in conservative thought, putting out an issue devoted to bashing Donald Trump.
One would have to say that the conservative figures who are actually elected to major offices, senators, governors and so on, are coming out against Cruz rather predictably. And by the way, Terry Branstad, the governor of Iowa, who is still a very potent figure, the longest serving governor in American history, has come out specifically saying that he's not endorsing anyone, but we have to vote against Ted Cruz because of his position on ethanol and renewable fuels. And that's a big thing for Iowa. So we've got that kind of establishment figure. And how would it make you feel if everyone that you worked with in your workplace was given the question of whether or not to say you needed a promotion, and every single one of them said no? They would rather promote someone from way out there in the world of reality television than you. So Ted Cruz is really getting negative reviews from his peers, but the conservative media, including radio talk show hosts and magazines such as you mentioned, those kinds of people are saying, no, Donald Trump is a bigger threat to the party, and we get behind Ted Cruz.
But I also think it's worth pointing out that with Ted Cruz, it's personal. He stood on the Senate floor and called Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican leader, a liar. With Donald Trump, you get the sense that the way the Republican establishment looks at him is, it's just business. What he's saying, there's nothing personal here. He's actually tapping into a deep vein of anger in the country. So I think that's a big distinction.
Could either Donald Trump or Ted Cruz defeat Hillary Clinton in a general election, do you think?
Personally, I don't see it. I think that Ted Cruz, and I think Karen's absolutely right that the reason that Republicans in the Senate dislike Ted Cruz is in large part personal. But I think they also take the view that he's offering bad maths to the conservative electorates in these primaries. I mean, I've had senators say to me, he's essentially, Ted Cruz's pitch is to the most conservative third of their party and telling them that they're a majority of the party. And they can be a majority of the electorate if you just get out these missing millions of Christian voters or evangelical voters or conservative voters who, in his sort of narrative, didn't turn out to the polls in 2008 and 2012 because the Republicans had an uninspiring, squishy, moderate candidate. Professional elected Republican politicians think that maths is a fantasy and it's a path to disaster.
Karen, yes or no? Could either of those Republican nominees defeat Hillary Clinton in November?
I honestly don't know. It's hard to imagine it if you look at sort of the underlying strengths of both operations, but there's so much time between now and November, and who knows what happens.
And we've been so wrong so often
Right.
in this race. Ron, just a yes or no? Could the Republicans prevail?
Not on their own. She has to beat herself, but she might.
So, we shouldn't assume that Hillary Clinton is the inevitable Democratic nominee because Bernie Sanders just keeps getting stronger. A new CNN ORC poll has him up 8 points in Iowa. He has a bigger lead than that in New Hampshire. Now, there's some reasons to be skeptical of that poll. It assumes huge turnout in Iowa. That may not happen. But Bernie Sanders has been the surprise. On the Democratic side, he has been a surprise. How is he doing, Ron? And if he wins Iowa and then New Hampshire, what does that mean for Hillary Clinton?
Well, we have not seen anyone lose Iowa and New Hampshire and then storm on to the nomination.
One.
Bill
Clinton.
Bill Clinton. Well, but that was because Iowa didn't happen that year. That year, Tom Harkin, the senator from Iowa, ran, and so no one paid any attention.
And
to
he
Iowa.
turned a number 2 finish in New Hampshire into
a
the
winning
kid.
finish, and nobody even remembers that Paul
Right.
Tsongas was the winner
Yeah.
in that primary. So that really is an outlier. It's very difficult to lose the first two contests that we have been so focused on for so many months, and where there are so many media people right now reporting, and then say, no, but look, really, I'm the winner here down the road. But she has a firewall in South Carolina. Bernie Sanders hasn't made the sale or really even tried that hard to make the sale to African-American voters, Hispanic American voters. He's saying that he will, and he's saying that they're going to come to like him when they get to know him, but he hasn't really made that connection yet. So if she can turn it around in South Carolina, turn it around in Nevada, then we get to the March 1st primaries, many of which are in the South, and those are probably going to be more dominated by Black voters, and they are probably going to be friendlier ground for Hillary Clinton.
But, we have seen news reports in the Associated Press and elsewhere that Bill Clinton, Chelsea Clinton are concerned about the direction of this campaign. What are you hearing, Karen?
Well, I think that, you don't even have to go deep inside the campaign. All you have to do is watch what the Clinton campaign is doing, which is they're attacking Bernie Sanders. First of all, they spent most of this campaign ignoring Bernie Sanders at the December debate. Hillary Clinton, you wouldn't have known he was standing on the stage next to her unless she was responding directly to one of his comments. She talked all about Donald Trump. but now they're attacking him every way they can think of. But the thing that's interesting, you go to a Clinton event and it feels sort of, the energy in the room feels sort of dutiful. At the Bernie Sanders events, it's passion that you are seeing. And after the first round of attacks on him, on his healthcare plan, he raised $1.4 million in a single day. So this is it's a phenomenon.
You know, the Bernie Sanders has put out his closing arguments ads. They include some ads about Wall Street. That's meant as an attack, or at least a contrast with Hillary Clinton. But also this very inspirational ad they put out yesterday, 60 seconds. It's to the Simon and Garfunkel tune America. It shows bucolic scenes of America. There's not a word spoken in terms of like, I'll do this, here's my position. It's all feel-good politics about people's excitement about Bernie Sanders. It reminded me, I have to say, a little of the Morning in America ad that Reagan did. And, you know, that's the kind of thing that can pull out people who maybe don't usually vote. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we're going to talk about some of those court decisions. Some of them have gone President Obama's way. Some of them haven't. And we'll take your calls, 1-800-433-8850, or send us an email at drshow.org. Stay with us. Welcome back. I'm Susan Page of USA Today, sitting in for Diane Rehm. With me in the studio, David Rennie. He's the Washington bureau chief and a columnist at The Economist, and Karen Humilty, national political reporter with The Washington Post, and Ron Elving, senior Washington editor at NPR News. We're going to take your calls and questions, read your emails in just a few minutes. But first, we want to talk about this situation in Flint, Michigan. We did a show on Flint, Michigan earlier this week on the Diane Rehm Show. I've got to say, it's shocking that as more information comes out, as more emails are released, what happened there to the people in that community. President Obama was visiting Michigan to do something else, and the Flint story just kept cropping up. David, tell us what the president is doing, what the federal government is doing when it comes to the Flint, Michigan water crisis.
So the president, before he went to Detroit to give a speech that was originally going to be about, the recovery of the auto industry and stuff, he had the mayor of Flint, Michigan, into the Oval Office, and he said some very personal remarks about how no one should have to put their own kids in that sort of danger in an American city. I mean, I think it clearly, this situation upsets him a great deal. The federal government has given some money. You're seeing the usual FEMA sort of help coming in and bottled water and money. But there is an interesting interplay, because for a moment at the beginning of the week, it looked like this was going to be a sort of, not that everything is partisan, but it looked like a story that was tough for the Republican governor of Michigan. There were these emails released which showed, that they hadn't taken it as seriously as they should have done. It looked like being a bit of a story about, a white Republican governor perhaps not caring about an African-American, very poor, broken city. But we've also seen a resignation now from the federal, from one of the local officials who was in charge of that area for the Environmental Protection Agency has resigned. And so there was an element of federal oversight that failed as well. But I think, people are having an important conversation about how this can happen in a country as rich as America and whether it happens because these are poor cities.
We have a caller, Carl, who's calling us from Saginaw, Michigan, which is, I think, near Flint. Carl, is that what you wanted to talk about?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Yeah, I live just north of Flint, Michigan. Our water is okay. We're really disappointed in what's happened here. And there's some local blame, county, city. They've had emergency managers in Flint appointed by the governor. And this morning I heard the governor blaming, like mid-level bureaucrats. Why would the mid-level bureaucrat on information that there's lead in the water?
Yeah. And of course, it's especially damaging, I think, for the governor, Rick Snyder, because, Karen, he sold himself. He was elected as one tough nerd, as being not an ideologue, but being a very competent manager.
Right. And as, somebody who could fix problems. I think that he in his State of the State speech this week finally sort of did a mea culpa, said, I am sorry, I will fix it. But in these emails, you see time and again, officials in his administration just dismissing this as, all about politics. But again, there's a federal, lapse of responsibility in this as well.
And of course, when he said, I'll fix it, you can't fix it for kids who have had raised levels of lead in their blood. There'll be consequences for that for the rest of their lives.
There could very well be, and that's the part of this that is so haunting. I think for parents who have done nothing more than give water from the tap to their children, now finding out that they've done this kind of damage, there is an enormous amount of blame and plenty to go around for all of the players here. I think the thing that's stunning to folks, though, is that there could have been any disagreement at any point about whether or not this was a serious incident. We're talking about 30 times the level of elevated concern in terms of parts per billion in lead in the water, 30 times greater, and in some children far greater than that. This exposure is horrific, and it's very hard to imagine why people had a hard time struggling over whether or not they had a problem.
And some heroes in this story: a mother who was very persistent, an engineer at Virginia Tech who used the Freedom of Information Act to get information out about this, a pediatrician in Flint who raised this issue, was attacked for it, persisted. So there's some heroes in this story, but there are some people who really fall short as well. He was also, President Obama, when he was in Michigan, also had to confront another issue in Michigan involving the Detroit schools. David, can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so Detroit is not out of the woods. I mean, the president was there to celebrate the recovery of the auto industry and to celebrate, some of these iconic sort of hipster brands like Shinoda watches that he went and visited that are making stuff in Detroit. But the problem is Detroit, for all it's recovered from the absolute kind of abyss of a few years ago in its bankruptcy, it remains a very poor city. And in particular, things like the schools are in terrible shape. And so we saw this week teachers effectively going on strike by calling in sick to draw attention to the incredibly bad state of the classrooms. And we've seen pictures in the newspapers of really horrendous classrooms, rats running around school corridors. I mean, places where, again, a bit like the water in Flint, a lot of people listening to this program would never dream of sending their kids to that sort of school. It just wouldn't fly. And so, people having to ask soul-searching questions about how come it's different in a place like Detroit.
And of course, Detroit, a great American city with an amazing history. So we're hoping for Detroit's comeback. And of course, it has come back in some ways, but obviously huge problems remain. Well, let's talk about the Supreme Court. This week, Karen, it agreed to hear a case challenging President Obama's immigration plan. This is a Supreme Court decision that could affect not only the immigration plan, but the power of presidents who succeed President Obama. What did the court agree to take a look at?
It agreed to take a look at President Obama's executive order, essentially, making it possible for a number of people, particularly children, to stay in this country who were brought here illegally. But the court also opened up some questions that the lower courts had not, with regard to the president's responsibility to diligently enforce the laws that are passed by Congress. I think the whole question of whether or not President Obama has exercise the power of his office within the constraints of the Constitution. It has become front and center in the Republican race. This case is likely to land in June, and no matter how the court comes out, by then presumably we'll know who the nominees of the two parties are, and no matter how it comes out, it's going to inflame this issue.
Yeah, that'll just be weeks before the national political conventions.
And we also are expecting the court in the month of June, probably, to rule on a highly visible case from Texas having to do with affirmative action based on race. And we also expect the court to have a ruling on another Texas case having to do with the access to abortion. So this is going to be a dramatic, once again, a dramatic June from the Supreme Court, just as we reach a political crescendo as well.
David.
There's a human side to this argument as well, which is really extraordinary, because this latest Supreme Court ruling, they're looking at the second of the big kind of wave of executive actions that the president took. This one is affecting mostly the parents of American-born children who themselves don't have papers. And I've done quite a lot of reporting for The Economist on this. It's amazing. You go to sort of schools in places like Nashville, there's a ton of kids there who have American passports, they're born in America, but their parents are undocumented. And what does that mean? It means their parents can't drive them to school. They're frightened to drive in case they get picked up at a stop sign or running a red light. It means that, they're worried that their parents can get deported. In some cases, they are deported. And these are future voters. Every year, Pew, the research center, put out some amazing numbers this week. 800,000 Hispanic kids turn 18 every year in this country, US-born citizens. So 800,000 new Hispanic voters turn 18 every single year. This is their parents, in many cases, who are in the court's eyes.
And the legal tension here is between, again, the Constitution's requirement that the president faithfully execute the laws of the country versus the long-standing principle of prosecutorial discretion. The idea that, many presidents have claimed, look, there's a limited number of resources available to enforce the law. And the president should have some leeway in deciding which of these cases are most urgent, which of the people, pose the biggest threat to the country that you need to concentrate on.
This is why the White House prefers that these be referred to as executive actions rather than executive orders, because what they're doing is they're giving a directive for priority to the prosecutors. And that, it seems, would be more within the purview of what the White House should do and what the Department of Justice should do, as opposed to an order, which sounds a little bit more imperial.
And even if in the real world they could deny this executive action, the idea that the resources would be focused on law-abiding people, even if they're here illegally, who have lived here a long time and have American-born kids, that's not likely. But the difference in their lives has to be huge. The difference of feeling confident that you're not going to have a knock on the door that tears your family apart makes a big difference. There was another case involving executive privilege this week. A federal judge rejected Obama's claim over records for that notorious Fast and Furious action that the Justice Department took. Who wants to talk about that?
Well, this is probably one of those programs that you wonder, is this as bad as it gets? Is this as bad an idea as there ever has been in the federal government? But the ATF, the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms folks, tried an experiment where they let some guns go that they thought would fall into the wrong hands, and then they could use the fact that those guns were going into the wrong hands to prosecute the wrong hands, or the people with those hands. And of course, some of these guns wound up actually in the hands of enforcers for the Mexican drug cartels. And some of them were used not only in Mexico, but at least one American border agent was killed with one. So this turned into a fiasco beyond fiasco, and attempts to cover up, to obscure who might have been responsible, have been bumbling around in the courts now pretty much throughout the Obama administration. And this court, this particular federal judge, Amy Berman Jackson, appointed by Barack Obama, has said, look, all the damage that you're talking about possibly being done to federal executive deliberative processes has been done. Get these documents out there. So Congress is going to proceed with them.
The judge said that she wasn't really questioning Obama's claim of privilege, but said the Justice Department had disclosed so much of the information that it undercut their ability to make the argument that it was going to be damaging. Now, it's still possible some of these disputed records are going to be held back. That's
right, because there are still privileges when it comes to kind of protecting foreign intelligence. I mean, I think underlying this, humming away there, is a fascinating dispute between the Mexican government and the American government, that Mexico, for all its very violent crime, actually has very strict gun controls. Guns are sold in Mexico under the control of the Mexican military. So vast majority of the firepower used by the cartels in their brutal sort of internal wars in Mexico comes from America, and in some cases comes from specific shops that I've spoken to Mexican intelligence officers who know shops in Texas where the majority of these high-powered rifles are coming from, but because of the politics of guns on this side of the border, the Mexicans would certainly tell you they don't get the cooperation, the help they would like.
Also possible the administration will appeal this ruling. The White House said they hadn't decided on that yet. Well, let's go to the phones. We'll talk to Doug, who's calling us from Birmingham, Alabama. Doug, thanks for being patient.
Thank you. While we're on the subject of liars and emails, I might bring up Hillary Clinton this week. They discovered the special access program emails on her server. Is there any one of you, my question is this, is there any one of you that believe Hillary Clinton, when she stood at the UN and several times since then and said that she didn't have any secret or top secret, and this is above top secret, emails on her server, do any of you believe her at this point?
Doug, thank you so much for your call. Karen, this is an issue that just doesn't seem to be going away.
Yeah, and it is now quite clear that there was secret classified material on that server. The distinction that the Clinton people make is that it wasn't marked that way. But the fact is what the law requires is that the sender of the email have responsibility for making sure that no classified material, it gets out of proper channels. So we're going to see the last batch of Hillary Clinton emails at the end of this month, or at least it's supposed to be at the end of this month. We'll see if the State Department makes its deadline for releasing them. But the issue does continue.
I'm Susan Page, and you're listening to The Diane Rehm Show. We're taking your calls 1-800-433-8850, and you can also see all our guests on our live video stream at drshow.org. Let's talk about just one more court decision that was important this week. This was an appeals court declined to block a key EPA carbon rule while it's being challenged in court. David, why is this important?
Because they could have, essentially this is the centerpiece of the Obama administration's attempts to use executive power through the Environmental Protection Agency to really try and change the way that electricity is generated in this country to generate less carbon, to put less carbon into the atmosphere. And they've done it this way rather than going through Congress, because Congress was never going to produce a law to do it this way. This is setting up, this is essentially making sure that this fight continues as opposed to ends now. This court essentially means they said, this is going to let this play out for a while longer. But you have a lot of lawsuits in a lot of states, most of them Republican controlled, who are determined to block this, and they are not going to cooperate. And we're going to see a lot more of this. But it didn't stop because the court is allowing it to run.
Yeah, and these controls are the main tool that the administration has at this point for meeting the targets that it pledged last month at the climate talks in Paris. So for that deal to go forward, this program has to go forward.
Let's go to Sarasota, Florida, and talk to Henry. Henry, you're on the Diane Rehm Show.
Great. Thank you for having me this morning. I think that a lot of people are reading the support in the African-American community with Hillary Clinton wrong. We saw the same thing in 2008 and 2012. Most of the older Black people I knew, and I'm African-American, were pronouncing Hillary Clinton's inevitability. But when you look at it, it was really a desire for Bill Clinton 2.0 because they remembered those policies. But for most of the millennials, and one of the reasons she's not getting that support is because those millennials don't have the memory of Bill Clinton. They don't have Bill Clinton on the brain. And so as the African-American community looks at Bernie Sanders' policies, what they will discover is that they're better for minority communities than Hillary Clinton's policies. And we'll see that play out as this contest goes forward. I'll take my comments off.
Now, Henry, before you go, are you African-American yourself?
Yes, I am. I am African-American.
And how about, since you talked about age, if you don't mind me asking your age, how old are you?
I'm 37 years old.
So you're in that younger group, not in the older group that has such a long history with the Bill Clinton.
Correct.
Correct.
I remember his presidency. It was good, but she's certainly not her husband, and the African American community hasn't quite teased that out yet. And I don't think the Clinton campaign wants the African American community to tease that out. I mean, we saw the other night in the debate, she spoke very highly of her husband's policies, and then she draped, basically Obama over her shoulders. And so I don't think that she wants that teased out. But I saw this in 2008, and a lot of people were saying that Barack Obama was not going to win, that he was a long shot, and they were really putting that support behind Hillary Clinton. The Clinton machine, a lot of people owe the Clintons favors in Washington, and so we'll have to see how that plays out in this election cycle.
Henry, that's such an interesting point. Thanks so much for your call. We do see a kind of generation gap to some degree in the Black community when it comes to the Democratic presidential race. We'll have to see whether Bernie Sanders can turn out younger African Americans to offset the support Hillary has among older ones. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Ron Elving, Karen Tumulty, David Rennie, and we'll talk about NASA reporting that 2015 was the warmest year ever. We'll take your calls and questions. Stay with us. Welcome back. I'm Susan Page of USA Today, sitting in for Diane Rehm. It's our Friday News Roundup, and with us in the studio, Karen Tumulty of The Washington Post, Ron Elving of NPR, David Rennie of The Economist. We're taking your calls. Our phone lines are open, 1-800-433-8850. And if you're just joining us, you can also watch live video of our show at drshow.org. Well, the Senate this week blocked a bill, Senate Democrats did, that would have really toughened refugee screening. Ron, what was the issue here?
Well, the issue really goes back to some of the terrorist actions of recent months, and of course to the enormous exodus of refugees leaving the Middle East because of the civil war in Syria and because of the larger war with ISIS, flooding into Europe, of course, and the United States trying to take some share of these refugees, not just from Syria, but of course a lot of focus on Syria. So with the idea of many more refugees coming in with the backdrop of the terrorist actions in Paris last fall, San Bernardino, even though there's not a direct link here, there's not a direct sort of cause and effect, nonetheless, the atmosphere is refugees coming from this part of the world are dangerous, and they have to be screened in ways far beyond the vetting that they've been getting up to now. The House wanted to have a bill to that effect. They could have gotten it through the Senate if there were fewer Democrats, but the Democrats still have enough to block action in the Senate.
The key element of this was that the FBI director and the secretary of the Department of Homeland Security would have to personally certify that each one of the refugees who was let into this country was not a threat. And
Get the drift?
and Harry Reid also pulled a strong arm tactic that I think we sort of weakened the appetite for doing this. He said that if this came to the floor, that he was also going to force the Senate to vote on an amendment that would essentially take Donald Trump's proposal of a temporary ban on all Muslims coming into this country and force the Republicans to go on record as being either for or against it. So suddenly the Senate didn't seem like that. It was all that excited about doing this bill.
David, I have to say, though, that some of the incidents that we've seen reported in Cologne, Germany, and elsewhere in Europe involving refugees has inflamed tensions there and concerned a lot of Americans.
Yeah, look, I think we have to be realistic about the politics of this. I mean, I think, the truth is that if your big concern is terrorists turning up in the United States and carrying out attacks, looking at the refugee policy and only the refugee policy doesn't make any sense. Because if you're a terrorist organization trying to send extremists to carry out attacks in America, you would find one with a British passport or a French passport or a Belgian passport, just stick them on a plane because they don't need a visa. So actually the refugee process, which takes years and years, is a really stupid way to send terrorists to America. So there isn't a kind of pure logic here. Having said that, my own magazine, we write these sort of high-minded editorials saying, people should be opening their doors, they shouldn't be closing their doors to refugees. It's a hard sell. People want to feel safe. And that's not a completely unreasonable thing to want to feel. And they look at these events in Cologne and they draw, all kinds of links and just go, why are we even letting these people come anywhere near us? Even though America's taken hardly any. That's another important point.
The president has said that he will bring in 10,000 Syrian refugees over the next year. Do you guys think that will still happen? Do you think that'll happen, Ron?
I don't believe that will happen. It's become just too much of a point of ignition for a lot of the resentment that's being directed at immigrants in general right now. So I suspect that will have to be one of the many things that is forestalled by the presidential election and the politics associated with it.
Now, David mentioned that, in fact, refugees are screened quite extensively, but we have a visa waiver program that allows people from 38 countries to come in without a visa. The administration moved this week to make that a little harder, Karen.
And you're talking about, I don't remember the numbers, but it's just many fold greater than the number of people who are coming in as refugees.
Oh, it's tens of millions a year.
Yes.
Yeah.
Let's go to Toledo, Ohio, and talk to Barry. Barry, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thanks. I'm surprised that in the 8 months or so that Trump has been running for president, that no one has been able to say that the emperor has no clothes and make it stick. And here he is doubling down, having Sarah Palin come out and support him, and it even seems more inane to me than ever. And I'm just wondering if your panel has an opinion on
So,
anybody on your
Barry,
panel.
before you go, let me ask you, who are you supporting in the presidential race?
Bernie.
Okay. Barry, thanks very much for your call.
And Barry was probably not the target voter for the Trump campaign from the get-go. Those people who do respond to Donald Trump have only felt, I think in general, that his appeal has increased throughout this 8-month period. And I do feel as though many people in the media, and I'm talking here not only about the general media, but even the very focused conservative media, National Review magazine and so on, just really calling Donald Trump out in the most explicit kinds of ways, saying the emperor has no clothes, saying he's not a conservative, saying he doesn't belong in the Republican Party. And that's just the Republicans, the party he's running with. And you can imagine similarly how people in the media who don't share that particular orientation have been leveling their guns at him. So it doesn't seem to matter to the people that like Donald Trump.
Because the reasons they like him is not because they agree with him on his position papers, which, by the way, he doesn't have. They agree with him because he's mad and he says things are broken and he promises to do something about it.
Even though like his constant rants against political correctness, I can't tell you how many people I have run into on the campaign who are, even Democrats who feel like they've been, forced to watch their words a little more than they should. And I remember, okay, this is the oldest reporter trick in the book, but I was talking to my cab driver in Las Vegas, and he was telling me, I think I'm going to be a Bernie Sanders voter. And I don't like anything that Donald Trump says, but I'm kind of glad that he's saying it.
Interesting, David.
I think the other thing that's very powerful and is very difficult for us in the media to deal with is, we tend to judge a candidate by, as you say, their policy positions, and then we try and weigh out what makes sense. I went to a focus group the other day of Trump supporters, organized by Frank Luntz, the Republican focus group kind of guru. What was very striking was that it's a bit about Trump, but it's also about them. It's about their own sense of how they see the world. And they see the world in very clear terms. That, for example, self-evidently Muslims are a dangerous group he shouldn't let into America. And then they feel that people keep telling them, no, you're stupid and you're racist if you think that. What Donald Trump offers them is validation. He's a powerful, rich, successful guy who says, you know what? I hear you, and of course you're right. Of course that's how the world is. You see the world straight. And that kind of validation is a very, very powerful emotional experience, very hard to interfere with in the usual political ways.
Jay is calling us from St. Louis, Missouri. Jay, you're on the air.
What you all just said about 800,000 kids becoming U.S. citizens is what's propelling Donald Trump's electability. I never thought I'd be a Donald Trump fan ever, but what you all just talked about makes me think I might actually vote for him. I believe in climate change. I believe in a lot of things, but I'm possibly with him on this.
And what makes this an important issue for you, or an issue that might make you support Donald Trump?
Well, the composition of this country is changing so rapidly, and it doesn't seem like anybody else wants to do anything about it. I understand some countries in the world to be a citizen, your father has to be a citizen and things like that. But Donald Trump is at least wanting to look at that issue.
Ron Brown, thanks so much for your call, Jay. Ron Brownstein has an article, I think it's a National Journal, that talks about how different the Americas are that are represented by these two political coalitions. The Republican coalition represents an America that used to be the most, very much more white than the current composition of America. The Democratic coalition represents the America demographic that will be really a time of transition for our nation.
That's right. And I believe that many Republicans, or many people who feel that they would rather have the country the way it was in 1950, or even for that matter, the year 2000, than the country that they have today, or that they will have in 2020, 2025, are feeling as though this is their last chance, that this election is their last chance to really push back against these changes before Florida and Texas go the way of California and become automatic Democratic states in presidential politics.
But the fact is, this demographic situation is cast. These children who were born in the United States, they're American citizens.
They are citizens.
The most amazing statistic is Hispanics in this country aged under 21. 98% of them are US-born citizens. So you could build Donald Trump's wall. You could put a glass hermetically sealed dome over America and stop all future immigration. They're here. And they're citizens.
And this is why, after the 2012 election, some of the people in the Republican Party at the highest levels of the Republican National Committee put together a report saying, we really have to change the way we're talking to these people, because they are going to be the voters of tomorrow, whether we like it or not. There's nothing we can do to exclude them. They're the United States, just as we are the United States.
And of course, the diversity of the United States has historically been a source of real strength, resilience. I mean, and it's also, in many, I know it's been difficult for some Americans looking at changes in the country. It's been a source of America's vitality. It's part of our history.
But when you hear people express these sentiments, it's really hard to sort of untangle all the different threads of them. How much of this is about race, but one component of it is also economic, feeling a sense that, my generation played by the rules and my kids are not going to ever be able to succeed and do better than I did. And, feeling that part of the American dream is being lost as well.
And Jay, of course, our caller, was very respectful, and I think anguished about this. So a real debate in this nation.
But you can flip the economics on its head, which is that if Jay wants his Social Security payments to arrive every month, some of these kids need to get jobs and go to college and get well-paid jobs and pay the taxes.
Of course, you're making an assumption there about Jay's age. We don't actually know if he's getting Social Security.
Well, everybody will eventually, yeah.
Here's an email, a tweet actually from TP. TP tweets, I don't understand how unrepresentative Iowa counts really, or why the media obsess on it. It's true. Iowa is not a diverse state.
Well, and it's not, it's at least bigger than New Hampshire, the people in Iowa would say. Why does anybody get to go first? Why do we have a kind of retail politics that we do at the beginning of the process. I can tell you why Iowa and New Hampshire are first, because they've insisted on it and they've made it stick. But why those two states? That's another question. Why do we start out with such a tiny microcosm that isn't really representative? It's because of tradition. It's because of the way things have always been done. It's because you can't ignore them if they're out there having some kind of vote. It's like you can't ignore a poll. Anybody who says they're a pollster can put out a poll and suddenly have it reported in shouting volume all over the media. So that's why.
But the virtue of the system, and I certainly understand all the problems, is that it allows a candidate who is not well known, who does not have a lot of money, to go out and test his or her message and to see if it can resonate with people, see if it can build support. If California or New York were the first state, or Texas, that would not be the case. It would just be whoever had enough money to blanket the airwaves.
If we didn't have this system, would Bernie Sanders be a credible challenger to Hillary Clinton?
Not a possibility, because he started out May, basically, just a guy with a message.
TP, thanks so much for your tweet. I'm Susan Page, and you're listening to The Diane Rehm Show. NASA this week reported that 2015 was the warmest year on record. It smashed the previous record, which was in 2014. David, what does this report say to you?
Well, it falls like a kind of rock into the mud pool that is the debate about climate change in America. It should fall like a rock into a kind of lake, which causes huge ripples. We should be worrying about the fact that 14 of the 15 hottest years this ever recorded are in this century. Something is clearly going on. But to an extraordinary extent, what you believe about climate change is linked to whether you have a D or an R next to your name. It's an amazing thing how sort of rigid this has become and how little wriggle room there is really on the campaign trail about it.
And what state you're from. If you're from a state that is with the energy industry, which is struggling right now, but which has been the basis for the economy of many of our states, you feel that this is an existential threat, that people are coming after you. You may question their motives. You may think that climate change is just an excuse to come after you, but you are in denial largely because your economic interest dictates that you be so.
What about this big storm, Karen, that is hurtling toward us even as we sit in our studio here in Washington, D.C.?
Well, and of course, every time, this kind of data comes out, you'll have somebody go in the Senate and throw a snowball on the floor. So, the fact is that I think people have gone from calling it global warming to calling it climate change, just to make the point that this isn't just about the world heating up, but it's about much more violent weather patterns than we've seen. But it's going to take probably a few more years of data to sort of separate this out from the effects of this El Nino weather pattern that we're seeing.
Here's an email from Andy, who writes us from Vermont. He writes, why doesn't Trump have to put out detailed plans around his ideas while everyone else needs to? Are the rules different for Trump?
Yeah, sure. That's exactly right. Because what he's offering his people isn't a set of policies. He's offering them a feeling and an outlet for stuff that is essentially emotional and instinctual.
Here's a message from Michael from Brandon, Florida, who's given us a call. He says, if Hillary Clinton is not the Democratic candidate who prevails, is there a possibility that John Kerry or Al Gore could jump in? I might add Joe Biden's name to that list. Could the Democratic field get bigger, Ron?
Sure, it could get bigger, but mechanically it's extremely difficult to mount a campaign at this point. Now, if some cataclysmic event made it impossible for either Bernie or Hillary to continue running, surely the Democrats would come up with somebody. But if it's a matter of getting in to challenge one of those two people because you don't like the results of the first few primaries, that's an insuperable obstacle.
But you've got to wonder how many of these guys are out there sitting there kicking themselves that, this septuagenarian democratic socialist is actually mounting a real threat to Hillary Clinton.
So as you know, at 10 o'clock, we have the domestic hour of the Friday News Roundup. At 11 o'clock, we have the international hour of the Friday News Roundup. There was a story I really wanted to include. We couldn't figure out where it went because we should have a third hour, an intergalactic hour of news, but we decided to have it here instead. And that is reports that from two American scientists that they have discovered a planet beyond Pluto. They're calling it Planet 9. How exciting is that, David?
It's pretty exciting, and there's a kind of poetry to it too, because one of these scientists is the guy who killed Pluto. He's the guy who found that Pluto was not a planet.
No, he
So-
sent it to the kiddie
He
table.
demoted it.
Yeah,
He
to
sent
the
it to the
undercard
kiddie table.
debate. Yeah, so he's now kind of atoning for his earlier demotion by finding potentially this thing that explains why some little objects on the other side of the solar system behave in odd ways. Their orbits look kind of wobbly in an odd way, and one explanation potentially is that they're being tugged about by some gigantic, very, very dark planet a long, long, long way away but it takes 20,000 years to orbit the sun, apparently. So,
Yeah, you'd have to go like a long way between birthday parties if you live there.
How do you feel if you're Pluto? I mean, really, first you've been called a dwarf planet now instead of a real planet, and really seriously demoted. And a lot of Pluto's fans are very upset about this whole Planet 9 business. And this is really kind of a theoretical planet. It has not
We haven't
actually
seen,
been
no one's seen
observed.
it. Yeah.
That's the other way to say it.
Yeah.
It hasn't been observed and nobody's seen it. There's a Yogi Berraism in there somewhere. But the idea that this thing is out there 10 times larger than Earth, having this weird orbit that is not like the other planets is fascinating. And I think we're probably going to hear a lot of Planet 9 societies forming.
Planet 9, but I'm hoping there'll be some kind of Twitter contest to name Planet 9 in our future. Well, I want to thank our panelists for being with us this hour for the Friday News Roundup. Ron Elving of NPR, Karen Tumulty of the Washington Post, David Rennie from The Economist. Thank you all for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Susan Page of USA Today, sitting in for Diane Rehm. Thanks for listening.
The Diane Rehm Show is produced by Sandra Pinkard, Denise Couture, Rebecca Koff, Lisa Dunn, Alexandra Botti, Susan Casey, Danielle Knight, and Allison Brody. The engineer is Douglas Bell. Danielle Brown answers the phones. Visit drshow.org for audio archives, transcripts, and podcasts. Our email address is drshow@wamu.org. And we're on Facebook and Twitter. This program comes to you from American University in Washington. This is NPR.